So I got a phone call from Chris Pratt. I know, right? How ironic that he would be calling me, but I think it was because he wanted some workout tips. But he also asked for me to come along on an adventure. And so we were out fighting in space, like we do, because we're Guardians of the Galaxy. And turns out that we forgot to turn the camera on. And now we need some proof to really show our friends that we actually had a really cool space war. And we won. And so today, we're going to figure out how to do that with a little Photoshop trickery. To start, let's take a look at this background scene. As always, the files are accessible to you, and this one starts with nebulagalaxy.jpg. And this was just one that I pulled straight off of Adobe stock. And I've got some other files that we're going to be pulling in from as well. The first thing that I want to do, though, is I want to bring in my enemy ship. And I already went ahead and found another stock photo and did a little quick selection work for you to make this easier. But here's the file. You'll notice, though, that it's clipped over on the side. And this is because the original had it all the way over on the right-hand side, and it just sort of cropped off there. And so we could probably draw it in if we really wanted to. But I don't know that we necessarily need to at this point. So I'm just going to position it in my composition here, something about kind of like this. And I like the idea of it being actually about, pretty even there. And we'll come back to this thing over here and this cropping if it becomes a problem. So here I got this, I just dragged it in, made my little bounding box where I wanted it, and I'm gonna hit the return key, and it's gonna place it right there on the canvas. Now, I also want to sort of shore up my composition by dragging in the Milano starship. This is what Chris and I were in. And so I went ahead and also pulled this from the web. It's facing kind of the wrong direction though. So once I've plopped it in here, I'm gonna right click on it and I'm gonna do flip horizontal. And it's just gonna take it and flip it the other way. And it's a smaller ship, so I need to make this believable. So I'm gonna make it about like that. Now, I have these two files in here, and you'll notice that the enemy ship is kind of dark, but so is our nebula, but there's some blue in the nebula that's not apparent in the enemy ship, and so that's a little cumbersome. And then our ship here, with Chris and myself in it, Rocket, he was sick that day, which is probably why he called me. He's like, that's kind of okay, but it's a little bright, don't you think, for what the nebula is, given its current position? Luckily, Photoshop has a function that can help with this. And so with one of these layers selected, I'm gonna start with the enemy ship. The first thing that you're gonna have to do is we're gonna have to rasterize this layer. By default, when images come into Photoshop, particularly when you drag them in from Windows Explorer or the Finder on the Mac, it'll have this little icon on the right-hand side that looks like a little document with a little sub-document beneath it. That just means that it's a smart link to the original file. That way, if I change the file that it's linked to in the Finder, it will automatically update in the Photoshop document. That can be handy in some circumstances. For a lot of the circumstances that I end up with, it's actually more of a hindrance, but that's just how Photoshop does it. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click on both of these and we're going to rasterize the layer. Now that's what we call a destructive edit, insofar as, I could hit undo and undo that, but from this point on, anything that I do to those layers is going to be sort of set in the document. And so we'll have to keep that in mind from time to time. For our purposes right now, we don't have to worry about that too much, but what it does mean is that if we do something particularly dramatic to one of these layers, probably want to make a backup copy of the layer just before we do that, just so that way we have the backup if we need to come back to it later. Now, with the enemy ship selected, what I want to do is I want to match the color, and Photoshop actually has a function that can do this for us pretty much automatically. What we're going to do is we're going to go to Image, Adjustments, Match Color. And when we do this, it's not going to look like it did a whole lot because the source is not set correctly yet. And so the source down here needs to be the file that we're in. You'll notice that we started with nebulagalaxy.jpg, and so we're going to start with that. And then the layer will automatically probably select the layer that it already is. We don't want it to match itself. We want it to match what our background is, which in this case for me it's layer 0. It might be called background for you depending on how you open the file. Once I select that, you'll notice that it does a pretty good job of sort of matching the colors of layer 0, which is our background nebula, and putting those colors sort of in play on top of our enemy ship. Now you can adjust some of the settings here a little bit to sort of reduce that a smidge, which I'm going to do, and you can tweak the color intensity a little bit if you want, and the luminance, which is kind of effectively the brightness, and then color intensity is kind of a proxy for vibrance. I tend to err on the side of, and sort of stylistically, aesthetically, I like really vibrant things, and some people don't. Some people like things to be a little more darker, a little richer sometimes. That's a stylistic choice, and you can decide for yourself what you'd like. For me, I like color intensity to be a little bit higher, like that. And I'm gonna hit OK. Now it looks like, with the exception of our clipping over here, it looks like this actually was in this particular environment. The lighting sort of matches well with what else is in the canvas. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing with my Milano starship here. So image, adjustments, match color. Set my source to the file that I have open. If you have multiple tabs open, if you have multiple documents open by chance, you'll see multiple of these in here. You always want to go with the source document that we're working in right here, which for me continues to be nebulagalaxy.jpg, which you can see up in the top left corner there. And then I'm going to do the same thing, set my layer to layer 0. Again, pretty good job of sort of matching that. Now it looks like both of those two files, which were taken in very different lighting conditions, looks like they were probably taken at the same time in roughly the same place in space. Again, I'm gonna adjust my fade a little bit because I actually want the heroes, myself and Chris Pratt, to look like we're more in the front of this, and I want your eye to be drawn to that a little bit more. So I'm gonna make it a little bit brighter. I'm gonna reduce the fade on that. Also gonna up the intensity a little bit because again, I like those more vibrant colors. And then luminance I think is pretty much fine the way that it is. So I'm gonna hit OK when I do this, but you'll also notice that there's this neutralize checkbox here. I tend not to like this because I think that it sort of makes everything look about like it already did, but it's an option that can sometimes prove useful, and depending on the assets that you're working with, you might check it just to see what it does. I'm gonna hit OK, and so now I've got an enemy ship, I've got myself and Chris in the front in the Milano, and I've got a nebula. But we want it to look like, we were really kicking some butt out there. And so what are we going to do that? Well, one of the things that we can do is we can bring in some other assets here to make it look like we've just sort of shot at this ship and that we've been escaping, and then there are explosions, even though explosions don't really happen in space. That's a thing just for the movies, but hey, who cares? So what I want to do now is I want to go grab some more of my assets, right? And so I've got other things in here, like this fire texture. If I drag fire texture in here and then sort of drag around, I'm going to position it someplace kind of on top of the ship because it's going to blow up. We're going to make it blow up. Something about like this. Now you're looking at it, if I hit enter, you're looking at this and you're like, Justin, there's a giant black square. How the heck are you supposed to get that out of there? And it's like, you could try the select subjects and you can try the magic wands. They don't work so great on some things. Things like clouds, fire, water, those sorts of things they don't have a sense of scale and they don't have a sense of boundary to them, which can be useful in some circumstances and not so helpful in others. And so the way that we can do and fix this is we can just sort of come over here, and if we go down into probably either lighten or screen, I'm going to choose screen to start with. That does pretty good. Lighten also does kind of okay. The chunk that's in the lighten, screen, color dodge, linear dodge, and lighter color, if you ever wondered what these little divider lines mean in between here, these are sort of like-minded, similar algorithmic blend modes. And all of these around the lighten and the screens and the color dodge basically do something where they take out blacks and leave everything else. And so lighten and screen are very often something that I go to very quickly. If the background of the layer were white, then I would probably choose multiply. But in this circumstance, lighten and screen, lighten's a little too harsh, I think. I like screen there. And in fact, now I can actually make it a little bit wider. And as you'll notice as I'm dragging this, if you just start dragging from a corner, it'll sort of drag off in that direction. But if you hold the Alt key on PC or Option on a Mac, it will do this sort of proportionally on both sides of it. And so I want it something kind of like that. I'm going to hit Enter, and I'm going to commit that change. Now, it looks like it's sort of on fire, but if it was an actual spaceship and if we actually threw a missile at it and it actually kind of blew up, wouldn't it kind of be in two pieces? So if I come over here to my layers palette and I select the enemy ship, and if I come over to the left-hand side, you'll notice that there are some options for some lasso tools. Now the lasso, polygonal lasso, and magnetic lasso all do roughly the same things, but in three distinctly different ways. The magnetic lasso tool tries to sort of be smart and auto selects around objects. To be perfectly honest, this used to be used a lot more. It's a much older tool. I don't use it so much anymore because the select subject options within Photoshop and the AI tools are in there are actually so good now that it doesn't really come up very often that I need to use the magnetic lasso. The polygonal lasso tool allows you to sort of draw with points, so you can go click, 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 and sort of create pretty rough shapes. This is useful if the thing that you're trying to select is a perfect shape of itself, like a perfect square, has hard corners and like rectangles, triangles, that sort of thing. The lasso tool is what we're going to use here. It is just a completely freeform tool. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select kind of the front half of the ship. It doesn't really matter because it's an explosion, so it doesn't really quite matter where I select here, which is helpful. But I'm just going to click and drag a selection around a chunk of the ship, kind of about like that. And if I do a Command X or a Control X on a PC to cut, it will cut, right? And so now I've sort of cut off a part of the ship. If I do Command V or Control V on a PC to repaste that back in there, I can sort of drag it back into its spot, but now I have two parts of the ship. And if I drag one corner of it and sort of set it back behind a little bit, it will look as though I blew it up. And now it's in two parts. This is useful since we set the initial trajectory of it in one way. Now it's pretty obvious that there's something there that's going kind of the opposite way with the ship, right? But you'll notice I also have this sort of chunky slice that's in there, and so I need to do something more to kind of obscure this a little bit, and I still have to come back over here and deal with the crop on this part. So I have some other assets that I've pre-selected in here. We grabbed the fire texture last time. Let's try the small explosion this time. And you'll notice, again, I have this black background on here. I strategically chose this from the Adobe stock precisely because it was on a stark black background. It saves a lot of time to just grab the files that have either a stark white or a stark black background if they're not already pre-selected. And when it comes to things like clouds, water, explosions, fire, smoke, things that are very amorphous, that have very, very soft edges and kind of have a wild appearance to them, but yet are very defined to human beings because we've seen them before and we know how they should look. It just saves a lot of time to make sure that you grab files either on black or on white, because they're really easy once you sort of plop them in here, hit enter, go into screen, and all the black is gone. And it doesn't take any work except for just setting that blend mode. This is far easier to do because sometimes if you go out and do a stock search, sometimes it might be on like a dark brown background, but the screen blend mode doesn't work on browns because brown is brown and not black. Even if it's a very dark brown, or a very dark purple, or a very dark blue. If it's not stark black, the computer's going to notice and the algorithm's going to notice. So there's our small explosion, which isn't so small looking, but if I sort of position it there, maybe I can sort of tweak the size a little bit here and there if I want, but that kind of covers up. If I position it right about there, that covers up that slit. If I put it right there, you can sort of see it. I know that it's there. But if I put it right about there, we've got ourselves a pretty good little explosion piece right there. You could also consider adjusting the layers of some of these things a little bit if you want, and to see what they do. You could put them sort of under one another and see what that looks like. I actually don't know what that will look like. Because we sort of broke the front end of this off, I'm going to rename this layer so I know it. Front of ship. And I'm going to rename the back of ship. It's going to be pretty obvious that we're going to have to be careful with the blend modes that we have set, and also with the order that these things appear in. It's very likely that what I've got here is what's going to have to be. Although I kind of like it sort of a bit like that. So there we go. We have ourselves an explosion, and we've got ourselves sort of fleeing the scene, and we've got ourselves with a exploding ship. And we could continue to sort of tweak and adjust these things as we see fit here. About like that. Now, what else do we have in here? Well, wouldn't it be cool if we could add some sort of lasers or something? So I have this particular graphic that I'm not sure if it will work, but it looks kind of cool. The problem, though, is that I've got a graphic that, depending on where it's positioned in here, might be too distracting. So what can we do? Well, we can really lower the opacity on it quite a lot, right? Something kind of about like this. We're going to make sure that because these lasers sort of extend off the edge of the screen, we're going to make sure that they're really positioned correctly, so that way they don't sort of chunk off in weird ways. But looking at this, I'm going to continue to play with the blend modes on it as well. Something subtle needs to be here. Linear burn could be it. What I don't want is, I don't want it to just be too distracting, but I also don't want it to be so strong that it sort of mutes everything else around us here. Luminosity is kind of cool, but it sort of makes it very white looking. This is one of those things where, as an aesthetic choice, I like things that are very subtle sometimes. Pin light works well for me here. I kind of like that. It doesn't seem to do a whole lot to mute some of the blues and stuff back there. Screen, trusty old screen. You know what? That kind of works well. I kind of like that. So I'm going to leave it with screen for now. I also reduced the opacity here to 36%. I may end up coming back to this and doing something more with it later. Let's go ahead and deal now with the back of the engine of the enemy ship. So that's on the back of the ship right here. What can we do about this? Well, we could potentially draw something in, but we could also probably just erase parts of it that we don't need. So E on the keyboard for the erase key, and then the left bracket to resize down. You can also come up here in the top left and choose the size and the hardness. I want this to be very, very soft. I want it to be squishy almost. And then I'm just going to erase on this edge until that corner is gone. And now it's gone. Now I don't have to worry about it too much. I've got my small explosion here, continuing to sort of tweak this a little bit, but what else do we have here? Let's go back in and take a look at color smoke.jpg. Once we plop this one in, this one's interesting. If I hold shift while I drag around, it will sort of chunk into neat little 5-degree increments. If I drag from the corner, hold Option or Alt on PC, can drag out from both sides. And I want it to be pretty big. I want there to be kind of this stark contrast on the left with the blue and on the right with the sort of pinkish colors there. I'm going to hit enter on that, and I'm also going to command left bracket my way down, probably to right above our background layer, and then I'm going to tweak with my color dodge. I'll play with these blend modes here for a second and see if there's something kind of interesting that comes from that. I quite like color dodge. Linear dodge is not too bad. That's very vibrant, but it's a little too much. That one's a little dull, in my opinion, in my estimation. I'm gonna go back with what I had here. I'm gonna go with color dodge to start. Again, because I kind of like the bright colors, but I'm also gonna reduce the opacity quite a bit because I want something that adds a little color but doesn't get too distracting. And so if I turn it on, turn it off, it's subtle, right? It's a little bit, but I think it's okay. So now I've got this. Now the last thing that I need is I'd kind of like it to look as though there's some motion, because Chris and I, we're escaping, right? So like we've fled the scene here, and I want to make sure that it looks like everybody knows that we got away. So I found these lightspeed.ai file in Adobe Stock, and so if I open this in Illustrator, because it's an AI file, it's going to look something like this, which is a pretty typical looking thing from a stock photo, or stock image rather, from an Illustrator file. And so I'm hoping that if I come in here, and just like in Photoshop, it has layers, it's on this little icon right here, there is in fact a layer for the background. And so I don't want that background. You'll notice that I can't just drag I could drag the lightspeed.ai file into Photoshop, but this particular graphic is a dark blue background and not a black background. So I want to get rid of the blue. You'll notice this leaves a much darker, blacker sort of outline around this. This has to do with the way that vector files have to deal with things like gradients and whatnot. It's very cumbersome and difficult to do that sort of blending with vector files. For our purposes in this class, though, we don't need to totally worry about that right now. So here I've got my Photoshop document. I'm going to Alt-Tab over into Illustrator. I'm just going to take these, drag it onto my canvas. It's going to come in nice and small in my circumstance here, but because it's a vector file, it won't get blurry. And so I've got all kinds of options. And so I'm going to just make it nice and big. And I'm going to position it sort of about, I don't know, something kind of like this. Now, here's the thing. Obviously, we're going to have to do some color adjustments here, and I kind of want it to look as though it's behind the ship, that I want the direction of it, so I want this part of it to be behind the ship. I can, yeah, something kind of like this. This looks as though like we're sort of speeding out away from that. I'm going to hit return there and plop that down. This might take a second depending on the size of the file. And so if I bring this all the way to the top, like this is pretty nutty, right? That doesn't look very good. But again, we can come back in here and we can apply these blend modes, and suddenly trusty old lighten and screen, because we've got this dark background that we don't want in that file, just sucks that right out and does kind of a lot of the work for us. And so at this point, it's a matter of taste. I think I kind of like lighten better in this circumstance, and so I'm just going to pick it. And you'll notice that because it's because we dragged and dropped it from Illustrator into Photoshop, it's labeled it as a vector smart object, and it has this little smart object icon next to it. And so now I kind of need to just sort of treat it a bit more like a bitmap. But before I do that, I want to see if I can't nudge this portion a little bit in, and so that way it's kind of flatter. And so if I do this from the side, you'll notice that it's sort of proportionally sizes everything down, which I don't want, because I want the front of it, I want this portion to stay the same. And so I'm going to undo that real quick to reset that. And so if I hold this one and drag it in, but if I hold the shift key while I do it, you'll notice that suddenly it doesn't proportionally size it all down. It just sort of smooshes it together. which is a bit more of what I want. And so I'm going to hold Option here to drag this to be a little bit larger. A bit like that. And then I'm going to hit Enter. It'll take it a second to render. I'm going to right click on this. I'm going to rasterize this layer. I'm going to hit E on my keyboard, and I'm going to delete all the parts that I don't want kind of here in the front. A bit like that. Now, I could also opt to see what it does if I sort of put it back behind some of these layers. Some of that works, some of it doesn't. Obviously, it has to be there, but having it kind of in underneath that explosion part works pretty well for me. You'll notice that it has to be under the starship, otherwise it looks kind of weird that it's coming off the top here, and so it at least needs to be a layer down below that. I think I kind of like it with more of the brightness back there, because having that brightness back there sort of draws your attention back a little bit more, and I kind of like that. So now I have this image, and it still feels like there's a lot kind of going on around the outsides of it. So here's a pro tip that will work pretty well for lots of different files. This also will work great if you are a photographer or a budding photographer. You can use this particular feature easily in Lightroom or in parts of Photoshop or even Adobe Bridge in some circumstances. Other apps have it as well. Basically want to make a vignette, and you've probably heard of that word. It's either a white or a black sort of glow around the outside that sort of tunnels our vision into a central spot into our canvas. And so we can do that a couple different ways in Photoshop. The way that I like to do it is I like to just create a new empty layer, a little plus sign down here in the bottom right. We've got layer 1. It'll probably, not necessarily, but probably need to be at the very top. I'm just going to go ahead and rename it to vignette. Now, a couple different ways we can do it. You can either draw a rectangle or fill that layer completely with black or a very dark color and then erase a big spot in the middle, or you can leave it as it is and grab a brush with the B key, which is what I'm going to do here. You're going to give yourself a pretty large brush. Hardness is almost certainly going to be at 0% for this. You can hold the right bracket to make that brush a little bit larger. I'm currently at 2300 pixels here on the brush size. If I hit the X key on the keyboard, you will notice that it switches between these two colors that are over here, the primary and the stroke. If you hit the D key for default, it will ensure that the black and white appear, and so you can hit X again to switch between these. You want the black to be on top, because that's going to be our fill color. The fill is whatever is on top. And I'm just going to come out here on the edges of this, and I'm going to slowly, sort of wistfully drag in on this layer a little bit of black. Now, if you go too far, you can of course undo this in chunks. This again gets to be into a matter of taste. Because you have a nice soft brush, don't make the mistake of thinking, okay, well, I have to be here while I draw. You'll notice on the screen, the red circle there is where I'm clicking, and then that, because it's such a large space that I've got around it from the softness and the size of the brush, that's just too much, right? And so you can undo that. What you really want is probably to be someplace down here, just so it's very, very subtle. And you probably want something up across the top like that too. If you find that it's like, well, I kind of like this, but maybe I did it a little too much on one side, grab the E key for the eraser, make your brush nice and large, check again that it's nice and soft, and then you can sort of erase on the edges, which is why it's important that for your vignette layer, which I have here on the very top, that it's a separate layer so that way you have that control to be able to sort of draw it in, take it out as you see fit. But here I've got my little scene as Chris Pratt and I have saved the world as the Guardians of the Galaxy that we all know that we are. And now we can share that on Facebook and Instagram, and everyone will know that we were there, which is pretty cool. So this week's assignment is going to make some similar use of some of these functions and some of these tools. Your job this week is to take the skills that we've just practiced here and put those into practice for this week's assignment. If you have any questions, by all means, reach out. Otherwise, happy Photoshopping.